I would like to welcome David Smerdon, Grandmaster, lecturer at the University of Queensland's School of Economics. Our topic today is gender gap in chess. To be more precise, participation and performance gap is what we're going to be talking about. It's my pleasure to welcome you, and I understand you have a presentation, so I think it might be the best way to go to show the presentation, and then we'll have a short discussion afterwards about the findings.
Perfect, sounds good. Thanks, Panna. Thanks a lot for inviting me to present. I won't spend too much time on the presentation, and then we can have a discussion about it. But you can see on the screen, I'm going to be talking about the chess gender gap. And chess gender gap is something we in the chess world have spoken about a lot, but it's often not particularly well defined. And if I can find a way to change the slides using my phone, it's very fancy. So when we talk about the gender gap, it's important to be a little bit specific here, because there are really two angles to it. One is the participation gap and one is the performance gap. We kind of already know what they are. On the left-hand side, the participation gap is the issue that we don't have many women in the chess world. It's about 16% of FIDE-rated players, and 11% if we look just at those with a classical FIDE rating. Interestingly, there's a slightly higher percentage when it comes to streamers in terms of the top earnings of streamers on Twitch, which is obviously a new career path that's developed since the pandemic in particular. But on the right-hand side, we've got the performance gap. And here we can see that the gap is a little bit more severe. For example, there's only one woman player in the top 100 players in the world, and only 2% of grandmasters. Now, these two gaps kind of feed into each other as well, so they're related. For instance, low participation may explain a fair bit of this performance gap that we see, and on the other hand, the performance gap itself might actually affect girls' motivation to continue playing chess, and therefore feed back as well into the participation gap. So those are some statistics that most of us are familiar with. I'd like, as a researcher and someone who's familiar with research that's been done about this topic, that hopefully I can try to summarize a little bit, I thought I would give you some information about empirical facts that we've kind of accepted now as being true. So the first is that this performance gap that we see, particularly at the elite level, is largely driven by the participation gap, but not entirely. There's still a little bit left. But when we talk about this in particular, what we notice is that both boys and girls generally drop out of chess around the end of school. Not all, obviously, but that's when the biggest dropout happens, after they finish school. But girls drop out much faster than boys, particularly around the age of 16. So you can see on the vertical axis here, I've got the percentage of girls or women at different age groups. And you can see it starts out reasonably high, around that 25-30%. But then drops off pretty severely around the age of 16 and never really recovers from there. We also know some things that affect the gender gap, and social factors in particular have been probably the most researched. Various things that negatively affect women's performance, and one of the most surprising ones perhaps is the effect of stereotypes. It's been shown in multiple studies that women chess players play worse against men than against women. And there's also evidence that men change their behavior when they play against women. They take longer to resign against women, even of the same rating as a different opponent, and they play riskier openings against women. There was even one study that found they played riskier openings, particularly against attractive women. Make of that what you will. I won't go into detail about that. But what I think is really interesting for this festival in particular is the very close overlap in the research about the gender gap in chess and research in the gender gap in STEM, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics. So in these fields, there are very similar sorts of problems, and so we can maybe learn some things from research in one of these domains and see how it might apply to the other. One of the big things that we've come to appreciate in recent decades of research in economics and psychology is that men are on average more competitive than women. This starts at an early age. It's been measured in various ways. It's a very robust finding. and competitiveness seems to be an ingredient for success in both chess and in STEM fields. But you might say to yourself, well, the women who actually keep going in chess, they push through the barrier and those temptations to drop out after school, maybe they're actually the more competitive ones. And in fact, that's actually been shown in the STEM fields. So even though women are less competitive than men on average in most professions, in the STEM fields, we don't find those differences. So it's almost like the more competitive women are the ones who've actually gone into that field already. And some research that I've done in the chess world seems to suggest the same. I developed a fighting chess index to look at the combativeness of players, and actually strong women players have higher fighting chess index scores than the strong male players on average as well. There are also potentially differences in preferences or interest in the game. Now, that's something that, again, has been studied in STEM quite exhaustively, and it's been found there that there seems to be higher interest for STEM by boys, which translates together with competitiveness into higher participation rates. We don't know a lot about how this relates to chess, however, and so far there's not a lot of research that's been done there. There's also the issue of a comparative advantage, and this is quite interesting because what we find in school in STEM fields is that around the world, girls don't do any worse than boys in STEM subjects. And in fact, in many countries, they actually do better than boys in STEM subjects. But they do much better than boys in non-STEM subjects. So when we think about a relative advantage or a comparative advantage, even though at an absolute level, girls do equally as well or better than boys in STEM, they have a comparative advantage in non-STEM fields. And from an economics perspective, it therefore makes sense that maybe they don't pursue STEM careers as much as boys. And it may well be the same for chess. So that's a little bit of the research that we know on these two fields, a quick summary. But why there's a gender gap is actually not as interesting, I think, to me and to a lot of people in this festival as what can we do about it? So it might even be that for whatever reason, biological, social, there's some natural level of participation where women don't achieve 50% participation in chess. But to me, that's not really the big deal. The real issue is whatever that natural rate is, if we're not there yet, then there's work to be done, which means that there are some girls out there who are not continuing with chess because of factors that we can change and who otherwise would like to continue. We may be missing out on the next Beth Harmon or the next, of course, Judit Polgar. So I'm more interested in things like what policies do we know actually reduce the gender gap, both in chess and in STEM. I want to briefly talk about three categories. One is role models and peer effects. The second is quotas. And the third, indices. I'll go through them reasonably quickly so that we can talk a bit about them. But just to say that there's been a lot of research, particularly in STEM, to show that role models make a big difference to whether or not girls continue to pursue STEM careers or put in lots of effort into their studies as well. So effort plus that decision to continue. Very interesting study done on this was done in Uganda, where this was a randomized controlled trial as well. So a proper experiment, controlled for all sorts of weird factors you may think that give the results. Some girls were given the opportunity to watch the movie Queen of Katwa, which we, of course, know is a fantastic movie for girls' chess, but they watched this as an example of a Ugandan girl who was successful in a typically male-dominated field. So it wasn't necessarily because it was about chess. So some of the girls watched this before their math exam, and others didn't watch this movie. And those who watched this were more likely to pass this math exam. Now, of course, you don't learn any math from watching Queen of Katwa, which is about a girl playing chess. But it's more the fact that being given this confidence and knowing you have the potential to succeed actually translates into performance results. And interestingly, we found that actually boys who watched it also did better as well. So it's not always a case that these policies are a win for women, which means a minus for men. That's not always the case. You can have positive some things, and I'll show you in a moment another example of that. There have been many other examples of role models to do with female mentors, also female politicians as well, and how this affects women's decisions to pursue careers, but also when to get married, when to have kids, and things like this. So role models really seem to work. And in the chess world, that means not just top players like Judit and Ho Yifan, but also in positions in the chess world of responsibility, authority, and leadership, such as administrators, arbiters, organizers, and commentators, which is very topical in recent times because of some incidents with commentators in women's events. So these things make a big difference, but not just those at a higher level, but also your peers. One thing that we do know from the chess world, from surveys that we've done of girls and women players, is that one of the reasons they quite often don't pursue chess is because they feel lonely. They feel that it's more difficult to put in effort into training and practice and going to tournaments when you're by yourself, when you don't have those peers around you. Boys seem to have some sort of more automatic network that they can rely on, and girls less so. And we know this in STEM fields as well, including science PhD programs and even in the military. And if you look at the most successful women chess players throughout history and also those in the current generation, quite often you can find some reason why they were not isolated, training by themselves, practicing by themselves. Maybe it was their sisters, maybe it was their brother in the case of Vaishali and Praganantha. Maybe it was the case of their father being a grandmaster like Liz Petz. So there are many examples showing that peer effects seem to matter a lot in the chess world, and there might be ways that we can change policies to try to improve this. One example of recently used in STEM has to do with web apps, creating spaces for girls in particular to see examples of role models and see that pathway for success in a STEM profession. We've had fantastic success with the Chess Kid program, making it a safe place for kids to get together, talk and practice chess. It makes sense to me that we do something similar for girls and women. Moving briefly on to quotas. Now, quotas obviously a very controversial topic, particularly when it comes to gender. One thing that I'll say about this is that in general, there seems to be a theoretical basis for why quotas can be a good thing for women's chess. And now we even have some empirical research that's been done in France to show that it actually does make a difference. So a recent study that was conducted by some very good researchers, one from Stanford, found that the introduction of a quota into the French chess league, where they went from 8 players to 9 players, where one has to be a female, led to a lot of positive effects over the course of time. A dramatic increase in the elo of women players in France, a closing of the gender gap within France, a large increase of the number of female players. So it trickled down all the way to those who weren't even affected directly by the quota. And most importantly, no negative effect at all on men as well. In fact, there was an increase in French men's chess compared to European chess at the same time. And the last thing is about indexes. Indexes is kind of a funny thing because we see them in all sorts of contexts. Human Development Index, a Democracy Index, Corruption Index, Inequality Index, often put out by the UN or other organizations. These are not biting indexes. They don't matter necessarily from a legal standpoint, but they're there, they stand out, and they can have very positive effect in drawing attention to issues within a country, provoking global conversations, and also empowering, in particular, grassroots organizations and individuals. And I think that would make a lot of sense for the chess world as well, to have some sort of women in chess index that FIDE could produce that includes metrics such as the participation of women, women in positions of organizational responsibility and leadership, and also an index that, through its ranking, rewards investment and development in girls and women's chess. So those are some very quick things there. I have some recommendations related to these 3 points. That was a brief summary of the research. I hope I didn't go too over time, Panna, but I'd be happy to talk now with you about this.
It was fantastically interesting. It seems to me that a general overhaul in society and stereotypes, and really just the way we look at men and women's abilities, various abilities, we have to start thinking a little differently. So I assume that it has to start at an early age, meaning parents have to provide their children with the freedom and with the freedom of thinking without gender issues. So in other words, STEM or chess or whatever it may be, Barbie dolls, it's all the same thing. Whatever you open them up to, that's what they will be interested in, no?
Yep, I agree. There's actually been a fair bit of research done on this topic to show that quite often it's not at the conscious level, but that parents, even when they don't mean to, uh, subconsciously steer girls in one direction and boys in another. One of the most interesting experiments on this was actually done at a science museum where they observed and recorded the way that parents would talk to their kids, where their kids would ask questions about a dinosaur exhibit or a science exhibit. When it was a boy asking, they gave a lot more of the technical details. When it was a girl asking, they left those details out. Now, a lot of these parents aren't doing this on purpose, but somehow this message is still coming across. And in the chess world, being a chess parent is incredibly difficult, particularly if you're not a chess player yourself. What do I do with this kid who coaches tell me is so talented at this game that I know nothing about? And I think if we had a little bit more infrastructure to make parents' life easier, particularly if you've got a talented girl chess player, there was some sort of infrastructure, a little bit more opportunities for girls' clubs to exist, whether it be online or in person. I think that would make the parents' job a little bit easier and hopefully avoid some of these biases that you mentioned.
You did say that around the age of 16, there's a large decrease, a large drop in girls' participation in chess. What do you attribute that to?
I think there is a social cultural expectation element to it, particularly in some countries where it's perhaps more expected that a woman will go on to be a mother and a wife as her primary identity characteristics. But there's also this uh, ease of how easy it is to continue with the game. And that has to do a little bit with the chess infrastructure we have in place. So for girls who really want to play chess and really want to play chess with other girls around them, school's a great opportunity to do that. We have a lot of inter-school competitions. We have a lot of team competitions. There's a lot of girls competitions. But suddenly, once school finishes, you're on your own. And if you want to continue with chess, you've got to make the effort to go out and find an adult club. And if you walk into the room for the first time, having only played in the junior and school ranks before, and you're the only woman in a room of 100 people, it can be quite confronting, I imagine. So without that continuation of infrastructure, with more opportunities for girls and women to still be able to meet and socialize within their hobby of choice, which is chess, I think we're going to continue to see a higher dropout for girls than boys.
Does that include an educational curriculum, you think? I mean, what schools do, or what organizations, as you mentioned, how important it is that they set quotas and allow women, moreover, invite women to participate in various aspects of chess.
Having those invitations with that quota sort of philosophy does make a lot of sense. And most importantly, we now have the research to show that it doesn't seem to be harmful to men or to women. It seems to have positive effects to both, at least in the research that we have so far, which is a very promising sign. But I also think, particularly with the success of the Netflix show, The Queen's Gambit, we have a lot more players around that 18 to 25-year-old age wanting to get back into chess. Maybe they haven't played for a while, and particularly girls as well, with obviously Beth Harmon being such a strong character in this show. And a lot of this is happening online. So a lot more people are trying to get back into chess using online tools. And like I said, we've got chess.com and Chess. We've got Chess Kid specifically for juniors. We don't really have somewhere obvious where young women around that age can go to meet other women interested in the game. It requires a little bit more effort, and maybe we can make it a little bit easier, create these sort of environments, particularly online spaces. I think that would have a positive effect on retention of women in the game.
Lastly, how do you see it? What are the implications for men's competition and women's competition separately, if any of these things fall into place?
It's a very interesting question about the segregation of competitions and also the segregation of titles. We have evidence only with respect to quotas in a chess league structure. There's been no research done, no direct evidence whatsoever about the effect of women's competitions or women's titles. Two very big issues with their own idiosyncrasies as well. Obviously, being a researcher, I want to see more data and I want to see more research being done. That's what I'm interested in. Anecdotally, it does seem to be the case, however, that having separate women's events have a positive effect on women's chess. And certainly it matches this problem that we've identified of women dropping out because they feel isolated or lonely or unable to train or practice together. So for the moment, the anecdotal evidence that we have says that it's a good thing. Hopefully in the future, FIDE and other organizations encourage a little bit more research in this space, and we can try to use that to work out what are really the best policies to grow the game for both genders.
David, thank you so much. It's been fascinating.
Thanks a lot, Panna.